2020 Pro Farmer Crop Tour is brought to you by Pioneer. For the best agronomic advice for your farm, count on your local Pioneer team for year-round advice. Pioneer, an American seed brand since 1926. By Pivot BioProven. Predictable, productive, weatherproof. Get a reliable partner. Get the new nitrogen. Get Pivot BioProven. By RCIS, responsible claims handling and payment. We've got this. At RCIS, our crop insurance team approach works for you. By Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. Experience the latest, most efficient fertilizer system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to your crops throughout the entire growing season. By Farm Credit Services of America. Thinking of buying farmland? Finance online at farmblend.com. By Farm Mobile. Harvest is no time to gamble on your crops. What if you knew how your crop stacks up with daily state-level yields as you combine? Join the Farm Mobile movement. Your field, your data, your power. And by Compeer. Compeer Financial is the leading financial service provider for agriculture and rural communities. Learn more at compeer.com.
Good evening, I'm Clinton Griffiths here with AgriTalk's Chip Flory, and welcome to the 2020 Pro Farmer Crop Tour result night for the first night. And Chip, we're doing things a little bit different this year.
We're doing things quite a bit different. You know, honestly, we're now to the point that I've always wanted the crop tour to be to.
Okay.
Because we're not limited by space.
That's right.
We are going everywhere. Everybody's got access to the information as soon as we put it out. It's not just the people in the room anymore, everybody. It's everybody.
That's right. It is a first for us, for all of us.
Right.
Of course, let's get to some of the things that we expect to show and bring to you tonight.
The pandemic is changing the way we do business. Everything from where we go and what we do, impacting every aspect of our lives. But the 2020 Pro Farmer Crop Tour goes on. Our scouts fanning out across the country. In the east, we're starting out in Ohio, an area that had an extremely wet spring last year. But how is this year looking? And in the west, we're starting in South Dakota, a state that USDA has said could see record yields when it comes to corn and soybeans. It's a complete 180 from a year ago. Our experts tallying up their results from the field, providing those results within the hour. All that plus expert analysis straight from the road. The 2020 Pro Farmer Crop Tour is underway.
Very exciting, a very exciting first day. Of course, we've got all of those great results. Those will be coming up within an hour.
Right.
We also want to remind folks, if you're interested in joining the conversation, just like we do every time, Chip,
yeah.
Whenever we have these meetings in person,
right.
You can do that by going to Twitter at hashtag PFTour20. That's
yes.
where we'll be fielding those questions. Tyne Morgan of our staff, she'll be joining us, fielding those questions and proposing them to the group as we move along. But for those folks that are maybe new to Crop Tour,
okay.
They're not sure exactly how do we get to the numbers that we get to.
Right.
Here's a little explainer for you folks.
Founded in 1973, Pro Farmer has stayed true to its mission, leveling the information playing field, giving farmers the same information that the grain handlers and the firms that buy their grain have. While remaining the nation's leading marketing newsletter, Pro Farmer has expanded its services to now include special reports, email, and of course, mobile. But for members, maybe one of the most valuable services is the ability to pick up the phone and talk to some of our market analysts. And this week, our signature event, the Pro Farmer Crop Tour, is back. At its core, this annual expedition is a discovery process, held the third full week of August since 1993. Scouts head to the fields and share what they find. The sampling and measurements are designed to get representative results for crop districts, states, and the entire Midwest, not individual fields or counties. Scouts measure 3 years of corn or count pods on 3 soybean plants from just one location in each field survey. Each sample is then identified by county so it can be tabulated by crop district. It's a critical juncture of the growing season, with the last USDA report 1 week ago and the next coming in 3 weeks. The Crop Tour provides a boots-on-the-ground look at this year's crop. And because we've been collecting data for a quarter century, we're able to do a deep dive into historical comparisons, not just year to year, but decade to decade. And as you can see, the tour covers 70% of corn and bean acres across the East and West tours. There are multiple ways to follow along as the tour winds its way across farm country.
You can follow the tour on Twitter. It's a great way to find pictures and comments from scouts on both legs of the tour. It's also a great way to connect with scouts and other followers.
Extensive coverage of the tour can be found across a variety of Farm Journal media properties, including 2 hours each day on AgriTalk Radio with Chip Flory, ProFarmer.com, AgWeb.com, and of course, Ag Day TV.
And join us for a special edition of U.S. Farm Report originating from the final stop in Minnesota.
Hey, that's going to wrap us up. Thanks for joining us on Crop Tour. We'll see you in the fields.
All right, we're joined tonight by a whole host of the usual characters, Chip. Of course, we've got you and I, our panel of experts. We've got Farm Journal's Tyne Morgan there in the blue dress, looking great. Hey, Tyne, how you doing?
Doing great. Kansas City Studios. We are ready for Pro Farmer Crop Tour results tonight, Clinton.
Absolutely, and you're going to be fielding questions for us all along the way, right?
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, hashtag PF2or20. I will filter through those comments. We actually had one. They liked the countdown clock in the opening video, Clinton. So thank you for that. But you have a chance to interact with us live tonight. As Chip mentioned, usually it's just limited to a set location on the west and the east each night. This is the first time we're opening it up to everyone that you can be involved. Ask those questions firsthand to Chip, to Brian, to Jeff. Those burning questions that you've always wanted to know about Crop Tour, you can do it tonight. Log on to Twitter, hashtag PF2or20. If you don't have a Twitter account, call up your kids, ask your wife, ask your husband. Just get on Twitter for tonight. We want you to join this conversation.
Absolutely. And that's what's going to make it fun, is just allowing all of us together to sit and talk and have a conversation. We also have Pro Farmers Brian Grady and Jeff Wilson. And Chip, I'm sure these guys, you guys had an early morning start today, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and all the scouts out there. Let's hear about the scouts that you've got with you this year, Brian. It's kind of a different group, isn't it?
It is, Chip. You know, in the past, we've had international scouts. We don't have them this year because of travel restrictions. We've had USDA staffers that have participated. They didn't get travel clearance. Many from the agribusiness industry that just didn't get company clearance to travel. So many of our scouts this year are farm, and we were heavily on them anyway, but this year even more so.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeff, you know, Brian's got a real mixture of different experience levels. You've got a really experienced group with you out on the Western Leg, don't you, Jeff?
I have the greatest scouts in America right now. I went out today. The weather was fantastic. But those guys hustled every stop, and we made every measurement we could. And we're getting the data that everybody wants to see.
Yep. You know, one of the things that we were concerned about this year when we were going out, because of some of the changes that we had to make with the scouts, we're traveling in two-person teams, and they're going to be with the same person.
That's right.
The entire week, okay? It meant that it's just a bigger workload. Yeah. That's the bottom line. It's a bigger workload. So what we're looking at doing out there is we're trying to make sure that we don't get too heavy in some areas, too light in others, talking about the crop districts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And making sure that we pull enough samples. Well, the 3-year average on the number of samples that we pull out of Ohio is 116.
Okay.
We pulled 108.
Wow, that's pretty close.
I'm not going to worry about it.
Pretty close.
I'm not going to worry about it. South Dakota, the 3-year average is 70, and Jeff and his team pulled 73 today out of South Dakota.
Wow, Jeff, you guys were moving today, huh? Actually getting after it.
It's all the scouts. Those guys are dedicated. They have done the work. We have master scouts on my side of the trip. Brian does too. These guys know how to go out. They know how to get into the field. They know how to get the measurements and get back in the car and go on to the next field.
Yep.
Hey, at the top of the hour, guys, we're going to obviously be rolling out some of the new data from today for Ohio, South Dakota. Real excited to get that information out. So I know people will be ready to have that out. Tyne, you've been on the crop tour a bunch of times. As you were covering that today, is it different having to do it from the studio there in Kansas City as opposed to being out in the field, boots on the ground?
Clinton, it's actually a little bit nicer. I feel like more coverage. We do have some videographers on each leg. We're able to zoom and do some calls with some scouts. And so, typically we would follow one vehicle for quite a few stops and get a feel for what they're seeing out there. This time we were able to talk to many different routes. And so I think that gave us more of a feel for what these scouts are seeing this year and really amped up our coverage. So I'm excited this week. It's a little bit different doing it virtually, but we're all learning. And there's things that can be better doing it virtually. And I think our coverage, it's a wider coverage base. And we're excited to see what these scouts see firsthand in the field from our trusted videographers that are out in the field, social distancing on tour this week.
Yeah. Brian, explain a little bit about what you guys are doing out there on the road to make sure that the scouts still get some of the experience of being out on the road together. We're being very careful with our social distancing and everything, but we're still trying to give them an opportunity to get that experience.
Right. Normally we would go out and we put 4-person vehicles together. So a driver and 3 riders. This year it's just 2-person vehicles. So we are limiting that. Normally we mix it up where we don't have people ride together for multiple days. This year we are keeping the teams together all 4 days. So we are making adjustments, obviously because of COVID but yet we also want to get the data and we can present it here each night and I think we got a really good mix, balance of those two things and the important thing is the data and the safety, and that we always say the safety up front and the good news is after day 1 we're all safe and we made it to our destination.
Yep, exactly. Wilson, what'd you feed the crew tonight?
We had some beef and some salad and some potatoes, everything that makes a scout run faster the next day.
That's absolutely right. Hey, if you guys were going to talk about Jeff and Brian, what is the one thing before you even started that you were most looking forward to trying to figure out or trying to discover? Jeff, let's start with you.
I think we were just trying to discover. Earlier you noted that USDA had said that the South Dakota crop was going to be a record for both corn and soybeans. So we went out there to see if the crops looked really good. And I think most scouts that went on the tour on the 10 different routes on the West would agree that it's a very, very good crop. Probably one of the best that some had ever seen out here. And it's a big change from last year. Last year, it was a moonscape out there. There was so much prevent plant acres, and that was it was so tough to go through those fields and not be able to go measure anything. This year, we went out and we measured a lot of corn and soybeans.
Yeah.
What about you, Brian? What's the number one thing you were hoping to learn this week?
Well, Ohio, obviously, I think that there's dry areas. Northwestern Ohio, West Central Ohio, there's dry areas. Are the good areas in the state enough to offset those poorer areas? And then, as we move across the Corn Belt here on the eastern side, and we move into Indiana and Illinois and then into Iowa, the central corn is expected to be extremely strong. And that was to the windstorm that came through earlier last week. And so, just to see what kind of yield potential's out here, both for corn and soybeans in the 3rd week of August.
Yeah, we want to remind everybody, if you're going to join the conversation tonight, do that via hashtag PFTour20. It's a mouthful. Tyne's going to be monitoring that for us. Before we get too much further, though, I think, last year and this year, there was a lot of talk around some of USDA's report and USDA's number. And prior to coming out, Chip, just last week, USDA out calling for, a 181.8 bushel per acre corn crop this year. 53.3 bushels per acre on the soybeans. Of course, the question is always, well, how does USDA come up with those numbers? And before we even started, you had a chance to talk with USDA's chief counter.
Exactly. Last week, I had a conversation with Lance Honig. He is the chief of the crops branch at USDA's NASS. And I just wanted to talk about the process, how they arrive at the numbers that they release in the crop production and even in the acreage reports. I wanted to start with the acreage reports because I thought it was so important that everybody understand that this year. So had the conversation with Lance last week. I was sitting in the basement. He was sitting in his house, and we've got that for you right now.
Lance, thank you so much for making time for us tonight.
Hey, Chip, always happy to help out any way I can.
Absolutely. I know that you are, Lance, because I think about some of the things that we went through last year with the big question marks over acreage and how generous you were with your time a year ago. We appreciate that. And let's go back and start with the acreage number, because we had that 5 million acre drop from the planting intentions on corn to the June acreage report. Kind of got people kind of scratching their head a little bit on that. But let's talk about the process and how we ended up at that number.
Yeah, and always like to remind people that, think about March and then think about June. And so when we talk about June acreage, I can talk a little bit about where that comes from. It's obviously based on a survey that we do of farmers. Nearly 70,000 farmers we reach out to roughly the first 2 weeks of June. We ask every one of them to tell us how many acres they actually planted this year. In some cases, it's still intend to plant, but the bottom line is most of those acres are in the ground. The ones that aren't, their plans are pretty well set, especially in a year like this. But a lot of people get caught up in, in March, it said this, but let's go back to March. That's roughly the first 2 weeks of March. It's based on intentions. Again, we're surveying farmers, actually a few more farmers back in March. But again, you haven't even put machinery in the field yet at that point. And so there's a lot of things that can change. And boy, this year, a lot of things changed. And as a result, you saw a bigger difference between the March intentions and the number of acres that were actually planted and reported that way in June. And, it happens. But you've got to remember that the June number is based on reports by farmers after most of those acres are in the ground. And even if they're not, they're just days away from going into the ground. So that is a much more solid number than what you would have seen earlier in the season.
Right. Absolutely. And you think about all the economic hardship and the COVID crisis and everything that has happened, how it impacted farmers' decisions going forward. We lost quite a chunk off the principal planted acres as well. And we're off sharply from what we saw just 5 years ago, 6 years ago on the total acres planted. So it was a strange year that ended up at the 92. Now the 92 million planted on corn. Soybeans, I think that number fit a lot better with trade expectations, 83.5 million, but it's the same process that generates that number, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's exactly the same process. In fact, it's the same farmers that we talk to. So it's, they're reporting both their corn and their soybean acres, as well as all the other crops that they grow as well.
Let's get into the August crop production report, because there was a change. Was it just last year that there was a change in how the number is put together?
Yeah, that's right. Last year, we actually, objective yield, we used to do corn and soybeans starting in August or for the August report. And last year, we made the change to where, again, for corn and soybeans specifically, we don't start the objective yield field work until the September report. And that was, at the time, that was billed as a permanent change. But I think a lot of folks kind of thought with all the unusual circumstances last year, maybe that was a one-year phenomena because of the situation we were in. But the reality is we always intended for that to be permanent. Yep. So this year, that'll be the case again. We'll start that work in September. And just a quick reminder why we did that. Obviously more information is always better, but we've got to be as efficient as we can. And the reality is we've looked back over that data over the last 10, 15 years. And honestly, with the farmer reported data that we have, the satellite imagery that we utilize for those crops, we can do just as well forecasting in August without the objective yield data as we could with it. And so it just makes a lot more sense not to expend those resources until we can get more value out of the data, which we certainly will. Beginning with the September report.
Yep, Lance, it's really important that you mentioned that you did the back testing on that before you made the change. Obviously, that had to be done. And if it makes sense to do it and you can save some money in the process, then great, you go ahead and do it. Okay, let's go to the September production report, which will include those objective yield plots.
That's right. And so we'll continue to sample farmers as well. So, for August, we survey about 21,000 producers. It's just a few less in September. And of course, a lot of folks are, why would you go down in the number of farmers you sample? Well, in August, we still got wheat, oats, barley, the small grain crops included. So, the mix of crops changes every month, so the number of farmers we need to sample changes. So we're going to go back out. We're going to survey farmers. In fact, many of the same farmers. So we like to make sure that we're talking to the same folks throughout the season, so that as you see those yield changes happen, you know that it's because the yields are changing and not just because you're talking to somebody different. So we're still going to have that information. It's going to be updated because we're going to survey them again right around the 1st. We're going to have those objective yield plots across the major growing area. We usually cover 70, 75, sometimes close to 80% of the production of corn and soybeans with those states included in objective yield. We've got sample plots laid out all across those states. So great information there. And then just a quick reminder, that's where we send those enumerators into the fields to take the counts and measurements. And as the crop matures, we actually harvest those sample plots, send those harvested results off to our lab in St. Louis, where we can do some calculations, independent of what we see in the field. And as a result, that's more information going into the process. And we'll continue to look at the satellite imagery in September as well. We'll continue to get updates from what the satellites are showing us and telling us. And we put all of that information together, and we're going to get potentially updated forecasts in September as well.
Absolutely. And that's a great spot to drop it off there, Lance. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. We appreciate everything that you're doing, and take care. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Thank you, Chip.
All right. Yeah, that was a great conversation with Lance. He helps us out a lot in the conversation in understanding that process.
Sure does. Yeah.
One very important thing about this, when they do the October crop production report, they do not start with the September number.
Okay, it's different.
They start fresh.
All right.
Every month is a fresh process to bring that updated number.
Yeah.
So it's quite the process that they go through.
Yeah, it is, and it's one that we always get lots of questions on when we're out on crop tour. That's why it's nice to have him here, kind of explain some of that process and the way it goes. Remember, if you have questions, you can ask them to us via Twitter at #PFTour20. Tyne Morgan's fielding those. She'll be joining us here in just a few minutes to go through some of the questions that have already been posed. And of course, we couldn't do this by ourselves, Chip.
No.
We don't do this alone. We have some great sponsors out there that kind of pitch in to help make all of this happen. Here's a couple of them.
I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Pro Farmer Midwest Crop Tour. My name's Amanda Reinhart, and I lead Pioneer Marketing. Although we're doing things so differently this year with these virtual sessions, the Pro Farmer Crop Tour is still a great opportunity to get a first-hand look at how crops are performing in fields across the Corn Belt. And because the same methodology is used year after year, it's a good opportunity to see how advances in technology are helping farmers across the country improve their yields. Pioneer is proud to once again be a premier sponsor of the tour for the 13th year. Built on world-class genetics, leading traits, innovative technology, and superior agronomic service and support, our product portfolio is stronger than ever. We have a revolutionary lineup of Pioneer brand corn products with agronomic strength, high yield potential, and leading trait choices, including Chrome. Our highest yielding Pioneer brand soybeans are available with Lumicina fungicide seed treatment and grower choices and new soybean herbicide technologies, including Enlist E3 soybeans. All of this is backed by our digital suite of tools from Granular, including Granular Business, Granular Agronomy, Granular Insights, and the Pioneer app with new Threat ID capabilities. Thank you to all the scouts that made this year's tour possible, and to all of you for joining us on this virtual tour. Our unmatched team of local Pioneer professionals live and work in communities with you across the Corn Belt. They're ready to help you select high-yielding products and provide year-round service and expertise. Thanks.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Virtual Pro Farmer Crop Tour. Pivot Bio is very proud to be a sponsor for this year's crop tour, and we look forward to all the information that we're going to receive from the reports and the observations that are being made in the field. Every year in agriculture is a new and different challenge, and certainly this year presents very unique challenges to us. And Pivot Bio's agronomists are out there working very hard. They're looking at what the crop status is, and they're looking at what our nitrogen-fixing microbes are doing in the field this year with Pivot Bio Proven. And on behalf of Pivot Bio, we'd like to thank you for everything you do, and most of all, your participation in this event today.
A big thank you to our sponsors. Of course, we appreciate their support. And remember, at the top of the hour, we will have the first night's results from Ohio and South Dakota, so make sure you stick around. But before then, still ahead, we're going to find out how you can get high-yield corn on your farm. We'll get some expert advice, plus what our scouts saw out in those fields today with those potential record-breaking yields that were forecast by USDA. Will they come true? We'll take a look, and our Pro Farmer experts are busy behind the scenes crunching those numbers, see what they're predicting. That's in a little more than a half hour straight ahead. And much more ahead on tonight's Pro Farmer 2020 Crop Tour as we go virtual. And before we take our break, we'd like to announce our first winner of this awesome weather station. It's brought to you by the folks over at RCIS. We're giving away one each night here during Crop Tour to one of you who have registered tonight's winner. I think, judging by Chip's reaction, we recognize Randy Ermacher of Hastings, Nebraska. Congratulations, Randy. All of you, please stick with us. We'll be right back.
Register for Farm Journal Field Days, the new American Farm Show at fjfielddays.com.
Welcome back to the Pro Farmer Crop Tour 2020 edition here, Chip, as we go completely virtual here. We've got our whole host and cast of characters joining us here as we kind of started discussion about what that first day of scouting looked like before we get to the official results. That'll be at the top of the hour. Time, you've been fielding some questions for us, and you've got one from Twitter. Why don't you kick us off with that?
Yeah, so this first one here, perhaps, he says, perhaps there's a better way to do this tour. Have thousands of farmers video themselves walking across the road from their house and take a bean sample and send the video. Like USDA, what do you think? Chip, I mean, does that defeat the methodology of ground truthing and going in and having these scouts with the set method, set route every year? How vital is that, and would this idea be a viable option in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I'm not going to discourage anybody from going out and taking samples out of their fields and sending them to us. We'd love to see them. We'd love to see them. There is something to the consistent randomness that we bring to the tour. We do it the same week every year. We run the same routes every year. We don't necessarily stop in the same fields every year. That's by chance. That's by the odometer. That's the driver's choice. Again, that brings some of the randomness into it. When we saw that question before, Clinton and I were kind of joking that's a good idea, but the farmer is either going to cherry pick the best field that they've got because they don't want anybody seeing something that isn't any good, or they're going to that gravel knob that's sitting out in the middle of a field that nobody knows about, and that's where they're going to pull that sample so that it pulls the numbers down. We don't do any of that cherry picking. We get into the field, go past the end rows 35 paces into it, down the main rows, and whatever's there is there. We're not It's very, very random that way.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, let's start and talk a little bit about what you saw out on the eastern leg of the tour today in Ohio, beginning with your kind of first couple of stops this morning. What did you experience there?
Well, Clinton, we headed west out of Columbus, and then I took a southern route down and looped around and
Hold your
came
mic
back
up there,
up.
Brian.
And we saw a fairly consistent crop from a standpoint. Sometimes you get into Ohio and the ear counts are all over the place. And my route in particular, we had a very narrow range in terms of the ear count. So I think that was, one of the things that stood out to me. Soybeans, the pod count's a little bit more variable, but once again, pretty consistent for an Ohio crop. That wasn't necessarily the case on all the routes, though. I happened to go on that southern route, and they caught some timely rains and have had more favorable conditions than what we saw in some of west central and northwestern parts of the state.
And Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you saw today? I think you went through a little bit of that there in the first block, but talk a little bit more about what you saw today going through parts of South Dakota.
So we went directly west out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, basically hovering north and south of I-90 over towards Mitchell. And we took about 12 samples throughout, and then we headed straight south to Nebraska. So we took about 12 samples in South Dakota, and it was generally every sample was good. Some were very good, and there weren't any disappointing things. The disease level was relatively low, or at least not unusual, and the bugs were not a problem, and it was just a very good looking corn crop. And the beans, we also had high pod counts throughout the day. Some other parts of the state, they also were, the other 9 routes we're traveling today, they also found some very good yield counts, both pod numbers and actual corn yields.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, a couple of my buddies up in South Dakota, they made a comment to me a couple of weeks ago. They said, you know, this you've got an idea of what you want your bean crop to look like when you put the seed in the ground in the spring. Very rarely in South Dakota do you end up there. This is the year that they ended up there with that crop looking as good as they hope it will when they put the seed in the ground. So it's a pretty good crop.
It's a very good crop. It's nice and even. It looks like a carpet out there, and the pod counts are good, and there's not a lot of disease. I think the dry weather has really cut down on the amount of wet weather disease that you'd see at the end of the season.
Yeah.
Now, both of you guys have some scouts there with you, and we kind of get you guys to zoom out a little bit, and maybe you can talk to some of the scouts that were along some different routes as you traveled. And why don't we start with you, Brian, see if we can get your crew there and kind of what they saw on their route through the state.
You have 2 of my scouts, Mark Bernard, who serves as my agronomist and right-hand man during the week, and I'll talk to him a little bit about what he saw. And then I have Bill Bayless, who's a master scout here, been with me for many years, and he farms in Ohio. And so he gives us not only the perspective of what he saw today, but what he knows from his crop in particular. I'll start with Mark, and tell us a little bit about your route. I know you went up north, so you caught more of that dry area than what I did. What did you see on both the corn and soybeans today?
Well, you're right. I mean, we did go up north more so. The corn side, we saw a lot of variability there. We started out with some 80 bushel yields, and that really shocked us. We really didn't expect to see anything like that. We increased a little bit as we went along, up into the 170 range, and the sample when we pulled right across the border was only another 86 bushel per acre yield. The soybean side, the pod counts were actually pretty darn good, pretty consistent most of the day. Averaged about 1,430 in that 3x3 on our route today. The only thing that bothers me a little bit is a lot of 1 and 2 bean pods on some of those plants. The flip side of that is there's a lot of small pods that if we get some timely rains, they're still going to fill and hang on to them.
Okay. Bill, tell us a little bit what you saw today and what it was, and then a little bit about your personal crop here in Ohio.
Okay, well, we did a split route. There's another bunch that went south of Columbus, back up to Walpock. I drove right directly to Walpock and started my route there. On the way, we was observing corn just doesn't have the flare this year. A lot of short plants. I think it's due to the cold May primarily, maybe wet when they planted it. Cold May, corn just didn't grow. So it just seems, I wouldn't say shaggy, but there's no shining crops anyplace. When we got to Walpock, we started there pulling our samples, went towards St. Mary's to Rockford there on the border, and Ohio. Our 3 counties we tested had 165 bushel average. Had the stands, just short plant height, but then that also showed short ears with some tip back. So then we moved across the border towards Berlin, Mayan, over to Marion in Indiana, and into Noblesville, we got 9 more samples as we went through each counter, and that come in as an average of 190 bushel the acre. And that's route now. Like Mark said, every route's a little different. But at the same time, we was doing our bean samples. We always come about where we had bean the corn fields right across the road from each other, and by and large, I like if those beans get one more good rain, look like they could be really good beans. If it doesn't rain, average maybe.
Yeah, and I think just the general attitude on the eastern side is that talking to scouts, the bean crop is pretty decent if we get those late season rains. If we don't, like you said, it's probably not going to finish as good as what it looks right now. The corn crop probably isn't as consistent across the board as what the soybeans are at this point in time.
Hey, Brian, I think Tyne's got a question for you. Go ahead, Tyne.
I do, and it's a reminder that I should have paid attention better in my agronomy classes in college. Anyway, Brian, the question is from Jeff Nail in Missouri. He asks, is Septoria brown spot an issue like it is here locally? Get into brown spot and any disease pressure. Can you ask Mark what he saw today?
Yeah, Mark, the question is on disease pressure. If you want to get into what you saw here in the state of Ohio and brown spot in particular.
Not a lot to talk, really. There was a little physoderma brown spot on the corn that I walked in. I was sampling beans all day myself, so I didn't get a lot of time in the corn, but I did walk in occasionally. You see an awful lot of disease pressure in either that matter. I did find one small pocket of SDS in the last sample we pulled in Indiana, but boy, I didn't see anything in Ohio at all.
Okay, and Bill, since you farm here, what have you seen in terms of disease pressure in the state?
It is really a pretty clean field. It's pretty clean, disease-free crop this year. I believe it's what it boils down to, but not much bugs, not much diseases at all. So a pretty healthy plant.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've seen a lot worse in this state from both a disease pest perspective.
Yep. Very good.
Yeah, we're bringing some questions in, communicating with folks as we go along here. Jeff, I know you've got a couple of scouts there with you. Why don't we turn the attention over to you and your scouts and kind of what they saw along their routes out on the western leg of the tour today.
Sure. Thanks, Clinton. So today I brought in Brent Judish. Brent has been a master scout. He's been on the tours at least 8 years, and he is my #1 scout. He went out and got 22 samples today, and that is a yeoman's journey to get 22 samples in a day with just 2 people in your car. So big rah. I'll let Brent, why don't you tell us what you saw on your route? Where'd you leave Sioux Falls, and where'd you end up in the state?
Our route, we left Sioux Falls. We head straight south about 20 miles. Then we went off west and kind of angled off towards Yankton. We pulled 6 samples. This is by far the best crop I've seen in my 8 years on South Dakota tour.
So what do you think was the biggest surprise in terms of how good it was? Was there something in the growth cycle you think that made that corn and soybeans do better than, prior years you've been out here?
Well, last year on the 2019 tour, we struggled. They had flooding. They had large prevent plant acres. So we had a really tough time finding a corn and bean field simultaneously to sample. And so a lot of that land is laid fallow for a year. And anytime that soil has a year to just take a break, they seeded it down to a cover crop. It's had a year to take a break. Now it's back in production. And when you get ideal weather, early planting, it sets yourself up for a great crop.
So what do you think that might have added to yields this year? 5%, 10%? Just guess. What would you say?
Well, if you look at the 1 and 3 year average from the crop tour, I think we're running 12 to 14% above that. So I'm sure a lot of that comes back to that fallow ground for 1 year.
Sure. And anything in the soybeans that was, did you see very much diseases or was it pretty clean and weed situation?
The cleanest beans we've seen for 3 or 4 years on crop tour this year. Beans were a little less consistent than corn. but we had some more variability. We had a couple samples were a little younger than the rest of them, so I think that they'll be fine in the end. It's just there's some beans that we're still developing yet, where the rest of the beans, the pods were set. So I think when they all catch up, they're going to be great.
So would you say that both crops need one more drink to make it to the end? Because I noticed it was kind of dry on my northern part of the route heading west.
Where we were, I would say the corn's probably made. The beans, probably one more shot would really help them out. But I think the corn's far enough along. The corn's denting. The ear size was very strong. So I think with the temperatures we've had, I think the corn can probably get to the end.
Pretty mature crop relative to what you've seen out here in the past?
Yes, it's been very mature, very consistent. The corn was extremely consistent through all of our samples.
All right. Clinton, Chip, back to you.
A couple more minutes here before you go anywhere. I think Ty Morgan has a question for you folks out on the Western Tour. Now, we've got about a minute and a half here. Go ahead.
Jeff, real quick, and don't forget, hashtag PF2or20. Colton wants to know, did you go through northeast Nebraska today that extends into Iowa? Initial thoughts, he says dryland corn has been strong in that area over the past 4 to 5 years.
I personally did not travel in that area, so I can't tell you. I haven't talked to the other scouts. We'll have more information on Nebraska tomorrow when we finish up the rest of the state. Brent, did you see anything? Did you come down the northeast part of Nebraska? You came down central part, right?
We came down from Yankton, headed straight south for Norfolk, and angled off for Grand Island. We got 16 samples in Nebraska. I was a little disappointed. I mean, Nebraska is usually very strong with irrigation, usually very strong in the bean crop, but I was a little disappointed. I thought it'd be a little better than it was today.
Okay.
You got to be careful when you do that, Brent. You know that, because tomorrow's going to change your mind about Nebraska when you get into the southeast part of the state.
That's absolutely right, Chip. Tyne, you've been doing some coverage for us out there on the Western Tour, Eastern Tour today. I think Betsy Gibbon was talking to some folks on the Western Tour today, but we've got some sound from one of the scouts. Why don't you set us up with that?
Yeah, Clinton, from what we're hearing, conditions were dry somewhat in southeast South Dakota, but they say it's one of the most mature crops that they've sampled in years. Here's Jared Creed.
Compared to last year where we went 19 miles before we even found a field that was planted, quite obviously it's considerably different.
202 bushel estimate. Maybe just like Matt said on the field before, that it might finish better than that. But once again, the biggest difference this year versus last year is holding good, heavy, dented ears coming through this part of South Dakota.
Size of the ears and the ear weights there, yeah. Chip, pretty interesting there, and he also said that it was one of the most mature crops that he's seen in South Dakota.
Yeah, I didn't see anybody in the notes that they make on the sheets. I didn't see anybody show any concern about the maturity of the corn crop in South Dakota.
Right.
So I think we're going to be just fine there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're hearing a lot about some of those big yields. That's been a topic of conversation, always is, Chip. And there are several aspects to consider here to help with some of that. We have Matt Essick, a product agronomist for Pioneer, and he's got some ideas on how to achieve those goals.
Welcome to the 2020 Crop Tour. My name is Matt Essick, and I'm an agronomy manager with Pioneer. I work in the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and I get to support the agronomy team as they work with customers on a day-to-day basis to drive higher productivity in their fields. I've been with Pioneer for nearly 21 years, and one of my favorite things in all of those 21 years has been seeing the increase in crop production on an acre-by-acre basis. And as we look for the next 20 years, I often ask myself, what's it going to take to go from the yield level that we're at today to the yield levels that we really want to be at 5, 10, 15, and even 20 years from now. And I don't think it's as simple as what it used to be. Several years back, we added fertilizer to the mix. We started increasing the levels of yields just by adding extra nitrogen or adding phosphorus and all the different nutrients that are really important to crop production. And while nutrients are still going to be extremely important for us going forward, I think there's a lot of other things that we need to think through as we drive our yields higher. I'm going to talk a lot about nutrients through this presentation here this evening, but I also want you to just be thinking about what's the next yield level? How do we get there? How do we set a goal where are we going to be at 5 years from now? And I don't think it's going to take just one thing. It's going to take a whole entire systems approach. And that's going to be like a crop management and a soil management all at the same time so we can drive those higher yields. We have to increase our root growth and development. We have to have the right tillage system or the lack of tillage, depending on what best suits your farming operation. We have to identify what was our previous crop. How does that influence the decisions that I'm going to make on my farm? What did that previous crop remove for nutrients? How will that influence what I decide to do as we move into the future? What's the soil pH like in my fields? Soil texture is something that we can't really change, but how do we manage different soil textures? Are there certain soils that are going to require different nutrient loads based upon what that organic matter level is in those particular fields? How about soil drainage? In recent years, we've had excess rainfall across many of the states that I work in. How do we manage that excess water in those saturated soils in order to minimize yield loss and to maximize our yield productivity? And something I think that's going to become more and more talked about in the future is some of the microbial activities that go on in the soil. Things that we don't fully understand, but there's an ever-evolving look at the biologicals that are all across the soils. So those are all the different things that we need to be thinking about as we continue to drive our yields higher. So in my mind, it all starts with one thing, and that's setting a goal. So what does that goal look like? If I'm going to set a goal for 350 bushels per acre, take a look at this chart that I've got up there. If I want to get 350 bushels per acre at 75,000 kernels per bushel, that's 26,250,000 kernels that I need to get. So if I start thinking about that, and I think about my average rows around is maybe 16 rows around, I'm 42 kernels per row, that's 672 kernels on that individual ear. That means at 75,000 seeds per bushel, it's going to take me 39,000 harvestable ears. So that doesn't mean I'm going to be able to plant 39,000 and get 350 bushels per acre. I need to get 39,000 replicated ears of 16 by 42, all with the same kernel size. That's not an easy task. But that is the first way that we can start to begin pushing towards 350, is understanding some of the different things that it's going to take to get us there. Now, not only is it the right number of kernels per acre, but we've got to be thinking about what does our soil fertility look like? Because we are obviously going to need to be able to feed each one of those kernels in order to get it to 75,000 kernels. So if you look at the chart that we've got up there now, there's a couple maps there of soil tests that we took in 2016 as the Pioneer Agronomy team across these states. And you can see where some of the phosphorus numbers ranked out at and where some of the potassium numbers ranked out at. As you go through that chart and you start thinking about what's low, what's medium, and what's high, there's a lot of cases where maybe we don't have that baseline fertility that's going to be able to get us up to that 350, 400 bushels or whatever that might look like. So what we need to be doing is doing a really good job of taking soil tests. If we don't have a baseline to build off of, we never really know where to go. Through Pioneer's work with our product knowledge plots, which is kind of our standard way of learning more and more about each individual product that's launched into the marketplace, we also have been doing a lot of work around characterizing those plots with soil nutrient levels. And one of the things that we did is take a look at what are the highest 20% of yield fields look like when it comes to K levels, P levels, zinc levels, all other different nutrients. And we identified that in a lot of cases, if you look on these maps, there's one for P, one for K, one for zinc. The P map shows where it's red, and the K map and zinc map as well. Wherever it's red, there's a high likelihood that our upper 20% fields that had the highest yields were higher in those nutrients than the ones that were lower. So those nutrients indicated to us that those nutrients are involved in higher yields. So I think that's something that's really important to think about. You know, we kind of reviewed what that 2016 data looked like. We've got some unique things from the past 4 years of soil sampling that we've done across all these different product knowledge plots. And we're starting to build a picture of these are the most critical nutrients when it comes to high yield production. The other thing that we focused a lot on is tissue sampling. And the reason we've done tissue sampling is we want to understand what do the plants in those higher yielding fields look like when it comes to nutrient concentrations. And if you look at this chart here, the tissue sampling chart, on the dry matter yield is going up the left side, and then across the bottom we have nutrient concentration in the plant parts. And if you see that where we're in that yellow range, that would be that we're deficient in that nutrient, and then we're in the marginal and then in the high. And then once we get excessive, we can actually have some toxic interactions with some of those higher levels of those different nutrients. So we're trying to identify what nutrient concentrations need to look like at different growth stages that are critical to the crop's development that would put us in that adequate to maybe towards that high range when it comes to nutrient concentrations in those plants. We've spent a lot of time the last several years working through those, and as we've developed some recommendations from that, it's really allowed us to build some strong 2 to 3 year correlations. As you can see from these charts here, these are the number of locations that we've been working in. You know, we're close to 2,000 different locations that we've done some tissue sampling work and correlated those tissue samplings back to yield, which a lot of times when we send our tissue samples to labs, they don't get correlated back to that yield. So with that said, as you look at this corn waypoint chart from 2020, this is kind of some guidelines that we've came up with when it comes to what do nutrient concentration levels need to look like within each individual plant at different growth stages. As I mentioned before, we've identified some key stages within those plants, within the growth cycle of those plants, that it's really important to look at what our nutrient concentrations are so we can drive higher yields. So for example, on this chart you see V6 to V8 for corn. You want to push your nitrogen levels greater than 4% leaf nutrient concentration in the leaves. And in order to do that, you might have to make a few adjustments in your nitrogen program. You also want to make sure that your K levels are greater than 3%. And those nutrients are extremely important, but so is boron, so is copper. Those targeted ones where it says target, and there might be a less than sign there. So for example, when we want to target our iron at less than 250 parts per million, that's one of those, if you think back to a couple charts ago, we identified that area where it becomes excessive or maybe toxic. That's one of those nutrients that can get you up into that range if we get to be a little bit too high. So these are just some targets that we've identified. I hope this information helps you on your farming operation. As you think about making changes for 2021, I would strongly encourage, if you haven't taken soil tests in recent years, get some soil tests done, get a good baseline of where you're starting from, take some time to analyze that, look through, go field by field, understand maybe why certain fields have higher nutrient levels than others. Think about what those previous crops were. Think about how does my soil drainage work in each individual field? What are my pHs like? What adjustments can I make that can help me drive into those higher yields? And then spend some time next summer doing tissue sampling. You saw those different times that we did that V6 to V8, sometime around R1, which is silking time. Take the time at those different times, grab those soil or those tissue samples, send them into the lab, get an understanding of where you're at, and then think about your soil fertility levels and how can we start to push ourselves into that higher yield. It's pretty exciting to think about the next several years. We're going to continue to enhance and refine recommendations that I just showed, and we're also going to continue to bring new products to the market when it comes to not only corn seeds, but there's going to be biological things that we'll be looking at that can maybe help with some of that nutrient uptake at different times during the growing season, or it can help us build better, robust root systems, or whatever it might be. But one thing about it, it's exciting to be involved in agriculture in 2020, and I hope you guys learn a lot tonight at this Pro Farmer Crop Tour. Thank you.
That concludes this Pioneer Agronomy video podcast. Visit our page on pioneer.com and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for more agronomy insights.
All right, great stuff, Matt. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, we know what you all are waiting for. Coming up next, we've got the numbers. Our experts are there doing all the calculations, tallying everything up. We'll let you know what Pro Farmer thinks the yields will be for Ohio and South Dakota when we return.
Register for Farm Journal Field Days, the new American Farm Show at fjfielddays.com.
Well, it's time for what everybody's been waiting for. Chip, you about beat me to it. The results
Exactly.
from Ohio and South Dakota. Introduce
Let's
us.
get to it. We've got our data manager, Emily Carlin, right here. She's got the first results of the night.
Yes,
Go ahead.
We'll get back into that, but first, I know what everybody's waiting for right now, right? So the Ohio corn numbers, this is the average of the scouts
right.
scouting today that we did. So yield came in at 167.7.
Right.
And let's jump over to beans, then we'll come back to this.
Very
right?
good.
So Ohio soybeans, we are up, okay, 51.3% in our 3x3 pod count
Right.
to a 1,155.7. Just huge pod numbers. Okay, South Dakota here. Corn number 179.2. That's a 16% increase over what we had last
huge.
year. Soybeans. I know.
I don't even know what to say.
It's massive. 1250.9 for a 50% increase year over year.
Yeah, year over year. Okay, let's go back to the Ohio numbers. And let's, if we can, let's get Brian back in here. I want to get his reaction to some of these numbers. The yield estimate, 167.7, that's up 8.6% from a year ago. Beej, what USDA on August 1 had the Ohio number up how much?
6.7% at 175 bushels per acre. So, our percentage is a little bit bigger than what USDA's was year over year, but it's in the ballpark. And so, it's going to come down to how this crop finishes. The ears are out there. Ear numbers are up. The grain length is up a little bit. The kernel rows are up a little bit. So all the factors that come into play are up, but it's really the number of ears that's driving the number.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. When we've got that ear count up at 95 and a half compared to that 90 a year ago, 6.3% increase, Brian. That's obviously where a lot of it is coming from. But we can't ignore the grain length. That was a 4.1% increase in the grain length too. So it's helping out. What it really does is it shows us once again, just how tough last year was.
Yeah, and when you look at it, probably the better comparison would be the 3-year average, and we're up 0.9% from the 3-year average. So we didn't blow it out of the water for the 3-year, but we are above that number. And the 3-year does take into account last year, which was a 4-year. So keep that in mind. But it's still a good, solid Ohio corn crop out here, no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Let's go to the bean numbers again here real quick. That pod count, 1155.7 in a 3x3 foot square. Brian, that's just a real solid number coming out of those Ohio soybeans.
Yeah, anytime you get the Ohio number up over 1,000, and in this case over 1,100, it's a good Ohio soybean crop. And you gave the percentage change, or Emily did, with the 51.3% up over a year ago. We're up 11.2% from the 3-year average there. So that once again shows you just the strength of the soybean crop. Mark mentioned it earlier in his commentary about the number of those 2 bean pods on the lower ends of the plants and some of those lower nodes. And so that, doesn't mean that it's going to hurt yields per se, but what it does mean is that we're probably going to need some late season rains to pump those up and produce a little bit bigger bean in the pod on those lower nodes.
Right. Emily, the one thing that we were looking at earlier, the moisture here, it is a touch drier in Ohio this year than what it was a year ago in the 3rd week of August. But with 3.2 on our moisture rating, that means that there's some moisture there for the crop to finish. I'm sure they'd love to get another rain, Beej, but they might be able to make it.
Well, it rained Sunday, so keep that in mind. That might have inflated our soil moisture numbers just a little bit today versus if we would have been out ahead of those rains. But they are still going to need late season rains, definitely.
Gotcha. Okay, let's go back to the South Dakota corn, if we could. Wilson, 179.2 for a calculated yield out of the state. Look at that increase in the ear counts, up 10%, but we got the grain length this year. The kernel rows around, they're always going to be around 16, but when you're above 16 for an average kernel row count, it's a good, solid start for that corn crop that's being reflected now.
It really is unbelievable. So I took 4 samples of my 12 that were over 210 bushels per acre on the rough and dirty estimate. And one of those fields, all 3 ears measured more than 8 inches in grain length. And I've never seen that in South Dakota. So the crop is there. The plant populations were very consistent throughout the entire day. And that's what brought the story up. I mean, just look at that ear count. It's up 10%. And, when you look at the yield up 16% from a year ago, that's really not a surprise. We knew it was up big, but it's, the thing is, it's up 12% from the 3-year average, and that's pretty remarkable. So that's just telling you how strong this crop is.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to the soybean data on for South Dakota. Look at the moisture there, guys. You've got moisture at 4.9 a year ago, 2.9. 2.9 is where we're at now. So we're getting into that dry area, Jeff, and you guys were talking about it. You definitely need another rain there to finish off that bean crop, right?
Right. The factory is there. The bean pods, I didn't think they were that flat. I mean, sometimes when you come out to South Dakota, they can be relatively flat at this time of the year, but they're not flat. But they need more moisture to finish out and be big plump beans. And the pod counts they were out of sight. What else can you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everybody out there, don't forget if you've got a question for Brian or for Jeff, go ahead and tweet it to us right now. Include hashtag PFTour20. And Tyne will find those questions. Tyne, have you found any questions out there?
Yeah, we've got a few coming in. Richard wants to know, did you find much prevent plant this year?
Great question. Prevent plant, Jeff?
Relative to a year ago, very little. There's still some out there. I mean, you can find areas that just, they couldn't get it in the ground. There just was one. It's probably an area that always is a little bit of a trouble spot, but compared to last year, it's small. I mean, there's definitely, you can see the little spots within a field instead of an entire field or an entire, whole district that was underwater a year ago. I mean, it was just unbelievable how much better this year's crop looks like. But there, you can see the prevent plant acres. It just isn't as relevant as it was a year ago.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the prevent plant in the western areas is even further north, up into North Dakota. There was quite a bit there. Beej, what about you? Do you see any over in Ohio?
No, not really, to be honest with you. The number one state on PP acres this year is North Dakota, like you mentioned. South Dakota is number 2, and Arkansas was number 3 based on the initial certified acreage in August. So, no, we didn't run into those types of problems this year, not nearly to the degree that it was last year.
Yeah. Wilson, do you feel like you saw a record corn crop for the state?
The ears were very heavy, and that's a good sign this early. So I think, kind of like Brent said, the crop's there. It's going to finish. It didn't look like it needed one more rain. I would say one more rain would guarantee that you're going to have very big test weights and very heavy ears.
Yeah. And then on the bean crop, Jeff, with a pod count like that, it takes more moisture to finish it off. Emily, you know that. You've experienced a lot of that.
Oh, 100%. And I've been looking more, last year was a rough year on this tour. It really was. When you start to look at that 3-year average comparison, though, in South Dakota, we're still up 12% on that 3-year average for our yield estimates. And we've had some that were heavy prevent plant years. And then this year, you think about all the fallow ground that was in corn production too.
Right.
I mean, it put into corn this year.
Yeah.
There's could be some surprises out there with some good ground. And I think from what I heard from the scouts today, they did an excellent job with taking care of weeds out there in a year that it could have been a disaster.
Right. Absolutely. Well, especially when you start with kind of a year where you were off. And you couldn't get in those fields to be able to fight the weeds back is great. Hey, Tyne, I know you've been keeping up with some of our questions. Any more before we get closer to this next break?
Oh, we've got quite a few. So if you want to keep them coming, them coming. Cody wants to know, how is the stand count in corn compared to 2019? Is there a lot of variance from plant to plant due to a cooler, wetter spring in some of those areas?
Okay, so I think I want to build on that just a little bit for you guys. I think what Cody's looking for is, can you see what's the ear set? Is it a consistent ear set, which would indicate that everything came up at the same time? And are there any of those little scrubby, weakling plants out there in the field, Brian?
Yeah, we did that. Both of those things actually, Chip. I read that Bill touched on it earlier in his comments. The plant height is just really short on the corn crop this year in Ohio, and it's noticeable. So that's one thing. We did see some spindly stalks, and typically Ohio doesn't have the big, thick stalk that we see in some of the central corn. But there were noticeable instances this year when it had a relatively thin stalk, and So I think that is notable. And then, there were skips in some of the fields as well. So ear counts were up, but they could have been up even more than what they were if we wouldn't have those skips.
Right. Wilson, what about you? Did you see anything that would indicate uneven emergence?
I would definitely echo what Brian just said. There were definitely some skips in almost every field. There was also some spindly stalks out there and some plants that didn't have any ears. So the story that I would say is that the crop could have been just monstrous in terms of corn in South Dakota. It's still going to be very good, but it still had some problems. Every year there's some problems, but sometimes there's a really nice even. Every plant came up and they're all the same height, and the ears are all right at your eye level. This time, this year they were variable, which tells you that those plants came up at a different rate.
Yeah.
All right, keep those questions coming. We'll keep having time. Jump in here with more of those as we go along. Hashtag PFTour20 for those questions. But, we know how the numbers stack up, but we want to see how they stack up historically. That's always, how does this compare to previous years? When we've got that information, we've got that data. We're going to go through that here coming up in just a second as our first night of Crop Tour 2020 rolls along. All right, the numbers are in. Of course, we want to put this in a little bit of a historical perspective. Chip, how does this compare to some of the things that we've seen in the past? Give us some of that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that we're really looking for in these charts, we're looking for the trends. Okay, do we follow the trends year to year? Let's go ahead with that first chart. That right there is the all samples chart. That is the most important number that we pull. Every year we pull about 1,500 corn samples. We put all the samples into one spreadsheet, calculate one average yield, and that's how well it tracks. Consistently, the crop tour has been just above USDA until we get into that 2016, 17, 18, 19 area when all of a sudden the crop tour, and USDA's final number started matching up really, really well. So we've got a couple of different calculations that we use, that we look at, but the bottom line is the number that we are reporting throughout crop tour, that's the same number that goes into that all sample number there. So that's very important. If we've got the Ohio chart, I'd like to take a look at that. Look at the trends there. We've got some excellent trends going. The crop tour follows USDA's final estimate very good. Go ahead. South Dakota, a little bit of a mixed bag here. You go back to that 16 year, it was really frustrating for us because we missed the trend in 16, okay? But since then, 17, 18, 19, we've been back on the trend, and I think we're probably going to be there again. Go ahead. Taking a look forward into the rest of the week, again, we had that 17 year there. Wasn't a really good finish for the Indiana crop, and we missed the trend. But we're back on it in 18 and 19, and it looks like we're looking for a bigger crop here in 20, according to USDA. That is USDA's August 1 number up there is the blue line. Go forward. Nebraska, the trend is always there. We're always, we are always below the final number out of Nebraska. And the reason there is very simple. We sample about 60% dry land, 40% irrigated. That's the opposite of the state. The state is 60% irrigated. So we're always going to come in below USDA's final in Nebraska. Go ahead. Illinois, the trend is right there. The crop has just seen some incredible finishes in 17 and 18. That's what got USDA's final above our crop tour numbers. Go forward. Iowa, the trend again is there, except that we've been light over the last couple of years. This, I tell you, I'm sorry, we've been heavy the last couple of years. No, they changed the color on me. Doggone it. So we are looking at a situation where Iowa, the crop tour has been a little light over the past couple of years. Go ahead. And Minnesota, real mixed bag right there. It's a little bit different, and I've got that figured out. I know exactly what happened. This is Iowa. This doesn't have the right label on it. Now, if we could go back to what is labeled as Iowa, this is my fault. Right there. That's Minnesota. There we go. All right. And so the history shows that we do track in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. The trends are there, solid every year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we're still getting some questions coming in from folks. If we can go over to Tyne Morgan out there in our Kansas City studios. And Tyne, you've been fielding questions the entire time via hashtag PFTour20 on Twitter there. What do we have so far?
Yeah, Clinton, I apologize. I may be cutting in and out a little bit, but a question from Jay Fretz. Variability in roll width as well as planting population, how does that accounted in your sampling?
Variation in row width. Okay, the row width is part of the calculation. It is something that we measure in every field, corn and in soybeans. Now on corn, our final step is to divide by row width. So it's obviously included in that. And on soybeans, since we're squaring everything up, we take the number of pods in 3 foot of row times 36 and divide it by the row width. That way we can compare a drilled bean field to even a 36-inch rowed bean if we find one out there. But there are plenty of 30-inch rowed beans out there yet. We saw a remarkable number of 15-inch rowed beans come in out of Ohio and South Dakota. So it's all part of the calculation.
Go ahead, Tyne.
Yeah, and Brian, Jeff wants to know that he noticed on soybeans that the scouts record maturity and soil moisture according to indices. Could you discuss what those maturity and soil indices are when you go out and take your bean samples?
Yeah, sure. The higher the scale, the number on the scale, the more mature it is, or the wetter the soil is. So a 1 would be extremely immature. A 1 would also be extremely dry. The higher up you move on those, if you get a 6, it's extreme saturated. So probably a situation where has rained recently, you're past your flower stage, obviously, well past your flower stage in soybeans on the maturity index.
Right.
Very good.
Okay.
Go ahead, Tyne.
Another question. Yeah, another question from Justin. He said, do you anticipate increasing your samples to increase your accuracy? I'm guessing that the higher variability in South Dakota is from fewer samples.
No, it's not.
It's a good question.
It's a good question, but it's not because of fewer samples. We pulled 73 samples out of South Dakota. The 3-year average is 70. So we've got plenty of samples. Now, we anticipated that there could be a problem with that. And we've got a spreadsheet, we put everything through it so that what it does is it weights it to the percent of samples pulled by district for a state, and we take a look at the 3-year average, we weight the yields and recalculate the state yield after it's been weighted to the historical percentage number of samples that we pull out of each crop district.
A lot of math in there.
A lot of math, yes. And everything squared up just fine. Everything squared up just fine. There was no influence from how the samples may have been split up just slightly differently.
And Brian, I mean, even out in Ohio, you guys were able to pull, almost all the samples.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Our sample counts were almost, I think they were off 8 from where they were last year in the 3-year average. So,
right.
8 samples out of 116 or whatever it was.
We're
pulled
off
108.
We're off 3 from where we were 2 years ago, Beej. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's right in the ballpark.
Yeah.
Scouts did a great job today.
That's a great question, Tyne. What else we have?
Yeah, Gene wants to know, so you talk about consistency. And Brian, I'm going to ask you this one. You talk about consistency. I'm sure 100% of your drivers have a cell phone with GPS. So why can't you drop a pin at the location that you're at this year? Then next year, the land is measured the exact same field.
Great question, but we want randomness. That's what the whole thing's built on, is the randomness. So we don't want to know where they stopped this year, where they stopped last year, so on and so forth. We want it to be completely random.
Another question, Brian, I can let you tackle this one too, or Jeff. Some of the routes don't cover the entire state, like Ohio, you didn't cover the entire state. South Dakota, you didn't cover the entire state. So as you guys crunch numbers at the end of the week, how do you account for areas in the state that you did not sample?
Definitely, that comes into play. And Monday through Thursday, all this data is crop tour data. So it's into fields, pull samples, put it into our formulas, and it kicks out numbers. And that's crop tour data. On Friday at 1:30 Central Time, Pro Farmer with our U.S. corn and soybean crop estimates and yield estimates. And that takes into account the crop tour data plus everything else. So those areas side of where we sample in each state comes into play. Acreage adjustments come into play. How we think the crop will finish based on weather to this point and weather potentially moving forward come into play. All those factors. And that's why the numbers that you see Monday through Thursday are in all likelihood going to be different than the numbers that Pro Farmer puts on these 7 crop tour states at the end of the week.
And Emily, you've got some ideas, some thoughts on this too.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we're really trying to do out there is that we're taking samples of a huge cornfield and a huge bean field.
Yeah.
That is the most accurate number that we come out with when we average all of the samples together at the end of the week. So to kind of put that in perspective, when you see only a couple samples come from a district, it's because it's such a small percentage of what the total national yield is going to be. So we consider that, the same percentage as what our whole samples would be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
You bet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tyne, I think you've got one more here that you've been asking folks.
Yeah, I mean, apparently winning a weather station isn't enough because Randy Ermacher wants to know which night are they sending us beer and steaks to eat while we watch the online meeting. So apparently it's just not enough, Chip.
I was waiting for Randy to send us the beer and the steaks. Come on, Ermacher, let's go.
I'm thinking, during COVID, our fridges are empty here. We could have used some, but that's all right. We get thought about last. But really, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. I'm sure we have some more. But Jeff, real quick, what do you think is the biggest misconception of Crop Tour every year?
I don't know what that is. I guess the bottom line is that I think Emily made a very good point. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take bits and pieces of all these 7 states and make them into one big field, and that helps us measure across the whole area. And we're not trying to forecast anything about the state. We're just trying to get the yield in those different states and then interpolate it into a national type yield.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's obviously appreciate all of you guys being here today and bringing some scouts on and having our conversation as we go through tonight's program. Appreciate each of you being with us. And of course, we're going to do this for the next few days.
We are?
Yeah, we're
coming back and doing it again.
We're going to do it every night between now and Thursday.
Somebody should have told me.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, maybe Randy will send us some food here as we go along. Emily, thank you for being here and presenting some of that information and the data. Of course, there's always tons of stuff to try to sort through, and we appreciate you crunching those numbers and getting it here.
Yeah.
Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing there. I mean, a couple of the big points that we took from today, right, is that it's a farther ahead crop definitely than what we saw last year, right?
Oh,
At
definitely.
maturity, I had so many comments coming in from the scouts that we were in full dent, 3/4 dent already. The one thing to note, though, for that South Dakota crop is that those kernels were maybe a little shallow.
Okay.
So take a look at that because we might have a test weight issue coming up.
Well,
You think of what pollination brought and the dries. I mean, it could really impact this crop. So we've got to consider that as we look into what the actual crop is going to look like at the end of the year once it's in the
Right.
bin.
Yeah, the moisture index was showing it.
Right.
If we are above that 3.3, 3.4, something like that, I feel a whole lot better about the crops being able to finish. When you're under 3 on the moisture index in South Dakota, it's going to need another rain.
And we counted a bunch of pods today. A bunch of pods, a bunch of beans that have great potential, but they need a rain.
Yeah.
They really, really do to get them filled out.
It is August, and we are waiting on some rain. And looking at the map today, when I was downstairs working on Ag Day, there's nothing right now in the forecast.
Right.
A big high over the entire Midwest here, so we're waiting on a little bit of rain. Well, we appreciate all of you joining us for our first ever virtual Pro Farmer Crop Tour. Thank you so much for being here. And if you think the Pro Farmer Crop Tour is pretty good virtually, we want you to check out some of the other things we have in store, especially the Farm Journal Field Days, a virtual event that runs from Tuesday, August 25th through the 27th. It's 3 days of everything farming, from the gear to the managing of crops, livestock industry experts, and of course, you control everywhere you want to go because it's all virtual, and the best part, it's all free. And if you register right now, you'll be entered for a chance to win one of more than 1,000 prizes, including a full-size side-by-side utility vehicle. You can go over to farmjournalfielddays.com to sign up and get the full contest details, and then make sure you sign up as well for the virtual and free Farm On concert to benefit 4-H. That comes at the end of the Farm Journal Field Days on Thursday. It's a 1-hour concert featuring some of the best and brightest stars in country music, including a couple guys with some top 10, top 5 hits on the radio right now.
That's right.
So you want to get signed up, head over to farmjournalfielddays.com to do that as well. All right, thanks everybody. We want to thank you once again for joining us for this first ever Pro Farmer Crop Tour 2020. Last thoughts, last words?
AgriTalk. Listen to it tomorrow morning. I'm going to have both Brian and Jeff on with me in the morning. Tomorrow afternoon, it'll be Davis, Brian, and Jeff, and really break down what they see in Indiana and Nebraska.
All right, and then tomorrow night, don't forget, we have the Indiana results show and the Nebraska's results show.
That's right.
And we'll be going through a lot of this all again with our experts. You can write in questions and continue to participate each leg of the tour each night.
That's
as
right.
We go.
That's right. Grab a steak, grab a beer, sit down, and enjoy it.
Yeah, tweet it up with Randy. All right, we appreciate it. Thank you all for watching and being part of this first ever event for us.
The 2020 Pro Farmer Crop Tour is brought to you by Pioneer. For the best agronomic advice for your farm, count on your local Pioneer team for year-round advice. Pioneer, an American seed brand since 1926. By Pivot BioProven. Predictable, productive, weatherproof. Get a reliable partner. Get the new nitrogen. Get Pivot BioProven. By RCIS, responsible claims handling and works for you. By Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. Experience the latest, most efficient fertilizer system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to your crops throughout the entire growing season. By Farm Credit Services of America. Thinking of buying farmland? Finance online at farmblend.com. By Farm Mobile. Harvest is no time to gamble on your crops. What if you knew how your crop stacks up with daily state-level yields as you combine? Join the Farm Mobile movement. Your field, your data, your power. And by Compeer. Compeer Financial is the leading financial service provider for agriculture and rural communities. Learn more at compeer.com.